Did you know that Reed had some peculiar comments when he saw Betty? He basically told her to come back and see him in 5 years, and we obviously know why he said that. That and other cut facts from this episode in this video. But as always, a big thank you to the channel members. A quick shout out to Radez, the Mario fan, Yume, Danny, Sammy, and finally Gonzalo. Over on my English channel, thanks to Pato, who, taking advantage of the fact that I'm doing double shoutouts for those paying for subscriptions there too, bought a membership here as well. And finally to Knup, whom I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, but thanks anyway for the support. Now let's get started with the video. Welcome to the cut content for episode 6 of the 4th season of ReZero. Before we begin, I want to mention something. Remember how in the last episode we had the narration of a witch's life? In reality, these narrations continued, and that's how we learned about the lives of the other witches. At least that's how it was when the story was told in the web novel format. However, when it transitioned to the light novel format, the witches' backstories were omitted. I couldn't tell you if the author regretted giving them those stories or if he's planning to create a new origin for each one. But regardless, today I'm bringing you the past of one of them. Even if it might not be canon anymore, it's still interesting to hear. At the same time, Subaru was busy snooping into the life of an innocent girl. The web novel was revealing the life of another witch, one whose life story bears a striking resemblance to Ram's. This witch was a woman born bearing the sin of not being what her clan expected. It all started with a group obsessed with reclaiming their former glory, breaking taboos to resurrect their founder, whom they considered a god. The result of those forbidden experiments was a girl, but her birth was seen as an utter disappointment. Instead of loving her, her own kind ostracized her. With terrifying coldness, her family ordered her to go off and die somewhere, decreeing that the mere fact of her birth was her greatest sin. Abandoned as a child in the wild, she wasn't supposed to survive, but she possessed a physical strength that defied logic. She survived for years like a true beast, drinking blood and crawling through the dirt. In time, she grew into a woman whose beauty was as imposing as the destruction she left in her wake. Drawn by rumors of a wild woman, a group of men decided to capture her to end her life. But upon seeing her beauty, they chose to keep her to satisfy, well, things I shouldn't narrate. There, atop the bed where she spent all her days, the woman began to acquire what she'd never had: words, wisdom, and emotions. However, she also developed confused thoughts toward her captors. Not knowing if what she felt was gratitude or obligation, she decided to repay them in a unique way. She broke the necks of every man in the residence, finishing them off quickly so they wouldn't suffer. After leaving them behind, she returned to her original home to face her true family, a race of giants sharing her own blood. Seeing them again, she felt a pure hatred she had never experienced before. Hearing their voices begging for forgiveness was so exhilarating that she smiled from the bottom of her heart for the first time. She threw the same words back at them that they had spat at her as a child, telling them they had to die pathetically because creating and abandoning her was their true sin. To reach that happiness, she dedicated herself to courteously and ceremoniously pulverizing every member of her race, leaving not a single survivor. She took her time with each one, ensuring that her clan's desire was completely destroyed. When no one was left and it all came to an end, she returned to the residence where she had lived with those men. Unlike the corpses of her clan, which she left to rot without remorse, she buried the humans with total respect, which is strange, considering everything those men did without her consent. Once alone in absolute silence, she let out a deep sigh of relief. She finally experienced what true tranquility was. She understood that no one would ever interfere with her again, and that taking action was a pointless effort. Thus, the Witch of Sloth decided to simply fall asleep forever, surrendering herself to eternal peace. This is the tragic story of Sekhmet, the woman who annihilated her own kind just so she could rest in peace. Much later, she would have a fight where she'd humiliate Volcanica. But that's a story you don't know yet. Remember that I've started a cut content series on the channel, and that was the story of Sekhmet, someone whose life bears a strong resemblance to Ram's. Both were created with the expectation of being the reincarnation of their clan's greatest figures. Both possessed unparalleled strength, and both developed peculiar feelings for their captors. But talking about today's episode, episode 6 of the anime is probably one of the best adapted chapters of this season. Not just because of the dilemma we see Julius facing, but because it literally adapted a full chapter from volume 22 into one anime episode. It was a one-to-one adaptation. I'm not complaining about this. In fact, it's what I wish would happen in general, so there wouldn't be so much cut content. But we don't always get what we want. I just hope they give the same importance to the moments Subaru will have later on. Otherwise, it would be unacceptable to give a detailed, well-crafted episode to a secondary character, but not to the protagonist. Just as Julius had his named chapter today, Subaru will have 2 chapters bearing his name, and I really hope they animate those with the same care as today's episode. As for the cut content of the fight, the absolute beatdown Julius took was much better than I had imagined in my own head at the time. Of course, there were inevitable changes that made the choreography different, but the goal was to show the despair Julius felt, and that was achieved. But since I know you want to know every change, no matter how trivial, here they are. The first difference is that when Julius is being dragged and Anna faints from helping him, in the anime, he stands up as if it were nothing after seeing his lady assist him. However, the novel clarifies that if he manages to break free from Reed's grip, it's because he lets go of his cloak, which gives him the momentum to slip away from his enemy. Something the anime perhaps didn't make as clear, which you have to deduce, is that Julius's attacks were filled with doubt. Reed perceives this, which is why he can't help but get bored fighting the knight. Let's remember that at this moment, Julius isn't at 100% capacity. This is more evident when we recall that Julius isn't just skilled in sword technique, he's a great swordsman because he combines the power of his spirits into his weapon. Since his bond with the spirits is currently broken, it's natural for him to be weaker than usual. Could it be that once his bond with the spirits is restored, he'll have a better chance against Reed? Who knows? But if the author wants to make Julius stronger in later chapters, that option is there. Afterward, the fight against Emilia begins. As you can see, I barely had to add anything to the Julius versus Reed choreography, so I wasn't joking when I said almost nothing was cut. I think the most peculiar thing omitted in the following fight is Reed offering Emilia a chance to spend a night together. Obviously, Emilia doesn't know what that implies, but this makes me curious. If Reed offers to spend the night with Emilia, I suppose we can expect he asked the same of Satella back in the day. Remember, the ending has already revealed that Reed was part of the group from 400 years ago, the group Satella was in. Then, something I saw left some people confused was Reed's mention of someone named Trisha. While she seems to be a woman Reed recognizes as interesting and gutsy, unfortunately, that's all we know about her. I've seen some in the fandom link her to the legends circulating about Reed. For instance, one legend says Reed defeated the Oni god, the same god Ram was supposedly meant to represent. Some believe Trisha was the previous Oni god, but honestly, it doesn't seem like a solid theory to me. But if you want to believe it, go right ahead. In the duel between Emilia and Reed, a line is omitted that tells us why she is so reckless against him. She deduces that despite being hellishly strong, he had no intention of killing them. Part of the omitted combat choreography included scenes of Emilia trying to hit him with every weapon in her repertoire. Sure, the anime shows some attempts, but not all of them. Regardless, we have to consider it happened. But what was definitely left out was a mention of Subaru feeling useless because Bayako told him that if they interfered, they would only make things harder for Emilia. So Subaru had to stay back and watch until it was over, ending with the scene where Reed uses chopsticks on Emilia's body. Afterward, Reed reveals that only Emilia passed the trial, and although the anime cuts the scene there was actually a really interesting omitted scene that allows for certain theories. I'll tell you about it. First, in this deleted scene, Reed comments that this was originally meant to be a group trial against him where everyone would pass. But since he didn't feel like following the rules that day, he changed it. There's also dialogue of Betty trying to negotiate with Reed. She tells him he's wrong because when Emilia took the trial, she said she was taking it for the whole group. Reed replied that he wouldn't fall for that wordplay and refused. Then something happened that I'm not sure I should say because Mushoku Tensei fans will surely use it to troll. But since I'm documenting everything omitted, I have no choice but to share it. When Betty speaks, Reed says she should come back to talk to him in 10 years. No, 5 years would be enough. I want to believe you understand what he was referring to, but even I didn't expect him to point out that a 5-year wait would be enough for him. Then comes the most interesting part of this section. Subaru talks to Reed and starts using English terms. This triggers a peculiar response from the examiner, which I'll put on screen for you. Who is that white-haired bastard? At the time, some believed that white-haired bastard was Flugel, especially since the Isekai Quartet novel reveals that Flugel spoke using English terms. However, in this same episode, it's revealed that the Reed we see here is a younger Reed than the one who traveled with the group 400 years ago. Because of this discrepancy, we're no longer so sure if the white-haired bastard was actually Flugel in some kind of transformation, or if he was simply referring to Echidna, who might have emulated the words Flugel brought and spoke while traveling with her and the others. Anyway, it's not a huge deal, but it's good for speculation. But returning to the present, the group decides to go back to the healing room at Milie's suggestion to treat Julius and Anastasia. Additionally, it's said that Reed had already gotten bored and was kicking them out. Interestingly, when Reed gets serious and doesn't want to talk to anyone, he apparently gave off such a hypnotizing aura that Subaru forgot to breathe. He says he would have suffocated if Emilia hadn't pulled him out of the trance. And that's how this cutscene ends. Afterward, in the meeting with Ram, almost everything happens in its entirety. The only thing omitted was that Betty initially underestimated the importance of Julius's sword being broken. She said the sword could just be forged again, so Subaru had to step in to tell her that a knight doesn't see things that way. Then the order of some dialogue in the scene was changed, but nothing significant. Before moving on to the second humiliation Julius receives, let me tell you a short story that is very much related to what's coming. This story takes place during Julius's childhood with Joshua, and it narrates how Julius admired Reed and how he met Reinhard.
For Joshua, the landscape glimpsed through the window had always manifested as a dream his hands could never reach. With that melancholy as a backdrop, he used to instruct his older brother, reminding him that a Juukulius must conduct himself with a formality worthy of his surname and that, therefore, he should aspire to go much further. When Julius questioned what specifically he should do to exceed such expectations, Joshua assured him with conviction that his destiny was to become a hero, while pressing a thick book against his brother's chest. Since the morning Joshua made the most important vow of his life, it had become a daily routine for both of them to have breakfast together and discuss various topics. Generally, Julius took the opportunity to complain about the strict knightly education he received from his father, while Joshua delivered lectures full of aspiration about what it meant to belong to their lineage. The book Joshua handed him in those moments was part of those hopeful lessons. It was the continuation of the legend of Reed Astrea, the chronicle of the life of the first sword saint, specifically, the sixth volume of an extensive 50-volume collection. Julius, his eyes shining with enthusiasm, celebrated obtaining the book, as he was anxious to discover what happened after the hero decapitated the plague dragon. Seeing his brother's joy, Joshua could not help but smile. The training to turn Julius into a hero was progressing successfully, as the brother who initially wasn't even familiar with the concept was now completely captivated by the stories. Julius was, in essence, a blank canvas, honest and disciplined, who day after day drew closer to the ideal Joshua had projected for him. Joshua experienced this growth as if it were his own, feeling that the adventures opening up before Julius were, in some way, his own adventures, allowing him to feel that his hand was finally brushing against that unreachable landscape. On one occasion, Julius looked up from the book, intrigued by his brother's fixed gaze, and asked what was wrong. Joshua forced a smile and assured him it was nothing important. He simply felt delighted by the interest Julius showed in heroes. Julius, somewhat embarrassed, looked away and scratched his nose, attributing the merit not to himself but to how incredible the book characters were. Joshua, seeing his brother's face slightly flushed, sighed and asked if it wasn't all becoming too much for him, referring to the burden of training with their father, the hero lessons, and recently, the discovery of his divine protection. Julius laughed off the matter of his protection, the spirit gathering. It had been barely a month since they had realized it, when one night, after talking late, Joshua shouted upon seeing dim lights accompanying Julius through the garden, only to discover they were minor spirits. Julius confessed he had always had a vague feeling of being accompanied and that, thanks to those spirits, he had never felt alone. Joshua wanted to know if the additional training to control that power was not excessive, to which Julius replied that, although it was a bit troublesome, it wasn't too much, as he felt he was made specifically to face difficulties. With unusual pride, Julius argued that, just like the protagonists in his books, heroes always went through complicated situations to leave their names in history, so being suited for trouble gave him the right stuff to be a hero. Joshua, caught between amusement and hope, nodded at his brother's determination. More than the literal truth of his words, what mattered to Joshua was that Julius walked the path of the knight and the hero with pride and not out of obligation. Both were still children, and Joshua trusted that they would progress step by step on their path as knights of the house of Juukulius, traversing that long and steep route together. However, Joshua's idealism was shattered the day he met a red-haired boy. In the royal castle, during a ceremony of loyalty before the king and the council of sages, Joshua saw a boy of his own age appear, walking with a gallant air. That encounter destroyed his naive vision, for upon witnessing the young man with blue eyes that captured the sky, Joshua immediately understood what a true hero was. That figure was the very definition of heroism, transcending his human and childlike form. Faced with the intensity of that hero, Joshua experienced a violent sensation of suffocation and lowered his gaze. Observing Julius's reaction, he discovered with amazement that his brother did not share his humiliation. Instead, he voiced his admiration, calling the newcomer the genuine article. Joshua felt deeply humiliated. The mere existence of that boy negated all his previous studies and efforts. The fact that they were children or just starting to learn were nothing but excuses in the face of someone who, with the same amount of life, was already a consummate hero. While Joshua suffered, Julius watched with bright eyes, as if he had discovered a dream and an ideal different from those Joshua had instilled in him. Before anyone could notice, Joshua collapsed, clutching his chest, unable to breathe. He was held by his father's arms as his consciousness faded into darkness. Although he heard the voices of his father and Julius calling him, he could not respond, and in his heart, he wondered if Julius was really looking at him or if he was still captivated by that hero. In that moment of weakness, Joshua found no value in his own existence and understood with certainty that Juukulius's path and his own would never be the same again.
I think that brief context is necessary to understand the thoughts Julius has in his second duel against Reed. In this duel, we see the knight face him, but he does so while full of doubt, which again causes Reed to label him as boring. While some thoughts were omitted, I don't think their absence affects much, but there was one I think would have been great to keep. At the end of these thoughts, when Julius is temporarily knocked out, he sees Subaru coming to save him. The protagonist calls him by his name, but at that moment Julius was so down that he didn't even feel worthy of being called by that name. I know an anime viewer can understand this without this extra bit, but I still think it was a line that shouldn't have been cut. And before moving to the staircase scene, I was very surprised by how Julius's memories confirmed something that not even the novels confirmed. At least, not that I recall. But before I tell you what I know, let me give you some context about an event that happened in Lugunica many decades ago. A long time ago, when an evil dragon attacked Lugunica, Volcanica reappeared to defend the city and subdued the rival dragon as if it were his younger brother. Although the dragon's rampaging caused human losses, it is said that a military instructor named Razak Gildark saved a small child even though this act cost him his life. It is said that this moved the child, who vowed to be an instructor like him. Eventually, this child would grow up to be a military instructor, but after a time and at an advanced age, he became the person in charge of teaching manners to the kingdom's princes. This person was Rickard Hoffman, someone who currently appeared in the anime and works as the manners instructor for the royal family. But before that, he worked as a military instructor, and I liked that the anime confirmed it was he who trained a young Julius. But it doesn't end here. Razak Gildark had a son before his death. His son was named Marcos Gildark, currently the strongest man in the army after Reinhard and the superior to the Redhead, Felix, and Julius. Details and connections like this really make you feel like the world of ReZero is connected. Though a quick clarification, these facts I just told you come from a novel that has two versions, an old one and an updated one. What I told you is the old version. Unfortunately, in the updated version published a couple of years ago, this mention of Rickard and Razak was omitted, so even I don't know if what I just said is still canon. So take this information with a grain of salt. After Julius is defeated again, there's a conversation between Reed and Subaru. The anime omitted it, but even just watching the anime, you can imagine what the conversation was about. Basically, Reed mocked both of them, and Subaru just rushed to take his ally to the healing room. And in the final scene, the staircase scene, there are a few interesting omitted dialogues. One where Julius explains that the nickname Stick Swinger is because Reed, despite his talent with the sword, never recognized himself as someone specialized in that weapon. Also, Subaru feels guilty for not speaking in detail about the strong similarity between these trials and Echidna's trials. He feels he shouldn't have hidden it from Julius at this moment. And the most important detail of this part is that Julius confirms that the Reed who was part of the group from 400 years ago was more of an adult than the one they met today. That is, the version that humiliated Julius was a young version, which in turn explains why Shaola knows him, but he doesn't remember her. Then, another interesting dialogue that I truly regret was omitted happens right when Julius is happy that Emilia passed the exam. I say it's interesting because Subaru thought that perhaps the situation didn't affect Julius that much, and the fact that he thought this made Julius's subsequent small collapse even more moving than the version we saw in the anime. Another dialogue I think wouldn't have cost anything to add was where Subaru admitted that if he left him alone, not only would Emilia not forgive him, but more importantly, he wouldn't forgive himself. Emilia not forgiving something is one thing, but Subaru himself saying he wouldn't forgive himself is a bit more personal, don't you think? Finally, there were some thoughts that really help connect and better understand why Subaru decided not to leave Julius alone at this moment. While you can deduce this just by watching the anime, I consider it necessary to add them here.
Subaru reflected on the futility of tallying up favors and debts, concluding that even talking about it was utter nonsense. Deep down, he understood that if he ever dared to settle the score, the magnitude of what he himself owed Julius would be beyond measure, a scale that had been tipping ever since that first encounter on the castle training grounds. That shared history allowed him to understand with absolute clarity why Julius had thrown himself at Reed, even while being fully aware of the impossibility of victory. Back then, Subaru had acted the exact same way. He vividly remembered how, despite knowing he would lose, he didn't hesitate to challenge Julius. It didn't matter how many times he was knocked down or how many blows he took, he got back up time and time again to face him once more, driven by an incandescent rage burning in his chest for which he could find no other outlet. The young man recalled the stinging pain he felt when it was all over, the bitter taste of loneliness following his argument with Emilia, and that overwhelming urge to burst into tears that washed over him the moment he was left alone. Because of all that, Subaru wondered how he could possibly let Julius walk down those stairs now in absolute solitude. He felt an identical rage boiling in his own stomach, a familiar, suffocating flame for which, at that exact moment, he could find no place to unleash it.
But that was all for today. Now let's move on to the author's tweets. First, the author says that even without his spirit connection, Julius's swordsmanship is still among the best in the kingdom. He even ranks him as the third most skilled. In fact, something I didn't say about the second encounter with Reed is that there were moments where Julius was trying to use his spirit's magic in his attacks, but they weren't responding to his call. Second, the silhouettes showing the strongest of each nation is an illustration Tappei commissioned from Otsuka, the light novel illustrator. Third, Tappei confirms what I thought a few minutes ago. This is the first time it's been stated that Rickard was Julius's master. Also, the author mentions Rickard's son, Rachel, again, and personally, I have high expectations for when both return to the main story. Fourth, the author reveals that at the time that version of Reed fights Julius, 3 months had passed since he last used a sword. But it's not that he was weak before. In reality, he was already the strongest in the world of his era using only his hands. And those would be all the recaps for today. Now break time would follow. Generally, with the break times, they usually include the most emotional part and leave out the comedic part. I have no problem with that because I think the emotional side is what distinguishes ReZero, and so far the break times have followed this rule. But today I feel this was broken, and not in a good way. In today's break time, we saw the misunderstandings happening because the group forgot Julius, and they just used this for a jealousy scene. But in the original story, which I told in a short, after the jealousy scene, the following happens. For Emilia, he found her holding Julius's hands as if they were about to dance. It turns out Emilia took the order to remove his stiff expression, quite literally, and was about to stroke his face to soothe him, when in reality, she was only supposed to talk to him and listen to his troubles. After a small jealous fit and once alone with the forgotten knight, Subaru tactfully suggested that his excessive closeness to Anastasia felt unnatural. Julius, with palpable sadness, admitted he was aware of his lady's discomfort. He explained that even if the world had forgotten the bonds forged in the past, he still vividly remembered his loyalty and the friendships that defined his life. He questioned whether acting based on memories only he possessed was an act of pure selfishness or a greed that only caused distress. Subaru was on the verge of telling him that if he already knew, he should stop acting that way. But looking at the solitary battle of that man erased from history, he couldn't bring himself to be cruel. Firmly, he assured him that clinging to his feelings was not a sin, and that he shouldn't accept an unfair loss just because the rest of the world couldn't understand it. Moved, Julius thanked him for the gesture and mentioned that he had started recording his experiences in a journal since the events in Pristella, adding that Subaru's name appeared frequently in his notes. Seeing the knight at peace, Subaru decided that, for the time being, he'd let Echidna suffer a bit longer under Julius's. As we can see, Julius's despair had already been dragging on since Pristella, and I think it would have been great if these dialogues were shown today to complement the emotional blow Julius received in his duel against Reed. I don't know who currently decides what will be covered in each break time, but I don't feel the choice of what was adapted today was a good decision. But that's all for today. I should be thankful that Tappei hasn't released a novel chapter, otherwise my day would be impossible. But remember, this video is nothing without your comments, so let me know what you think of today's episode. See ya!